Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is RonMan, and today I'm going to review The Simpsons Bart vs. the World for the NES. Also, if you're new here and you like my content, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as that bell notification so you stay up to date with RonMan Gaming. Bart vs. the World was developed by Imagineering and published by Acclaim Entertainment for the NES in December 1991, which was roughly only 8 months after the release of Bart vs. the Space Mutants. Instead of saving the world from Space Mutants, this time Bart has won an opportunity to take part in a worldwide scavenger hunt. Mr. Burns has rigged the scavenger hunt and he wants to get rid of the Simpsons I guess just cause he's a dick or something? In many ways, Bart vs. the World is an improvement over the previous game, but to illustrate these improvements, let's take a brief look at Bart vs. the Space Mutants. In every level of Space Mutants, the player is tasked with different objectives, such as collect hats, collect exit signs, pop a certain number of balloons, or cover up as many purple objects as possible. It was not just a matter of getting to the end of the stage, you first had to complete the objective before doing so. To a new player, these objectives may have been confusing. On top of that, players had to master some of the worst controls they had ever experienced. Space Mutants was also a very hard game. You only had a few lives and no continues. You could earn more lives, and to be fair, extra lives were all over the place, but finding them required skill. It also didn't help that you were dead after only 2 measly hits. In terms of music, well, Space Mutants only had 2 music tracks to speak of: the Simpsons theme, and of course this theme. Not that either of those 2 music tracks are bad, but it can get pretty grating to hear nothing besides those tracks. Space Mutants is a very hard game with a plethora of issues. Of course, the big question is, does Bart vs. the World fix those issues, and is it worth your time? Well, let's take a look at this game. There are 4 major areas: China, the North Pole, Egypt, and Hollywood. Within each area, there are a couple of side-scrolling platforming stages, as well as a handful of mini-games such as a match game, a sliding puzzle, among others. My favorite mini-game, by the way, is the Simpsons Trivia. I dominate this trivia. But the mini-games are optional. You can do them if you want to win more lives, and you might want to. Also, when you start a new game, you'll notice that there's a practice mode. This mode is just so you can practice the mini-games. That's it. Anyway, Bart vs. the World is a much more traditional action platformer. The levels are more in line with what you'd expect. It's pretty much just get to the end of the stage, although some of the stages are not linear, although they're not too big either. So that's good. The stages are full of enemies to deal with and items to collect. The items you can find are pretty typical: extra lives, extra health, ammo. You actually have a projectile attack that you can use to dispose of enemies. Honestly, I don't think this game is too bad. The first area is China, and it has 2 main stages. The boat is a good introductory stage. You can learn how to take care of enemies while coming to grips with the controls, which sadly are not any better than in the Space Mutants. There are plenty of items to collect, and this level isn't too long. The next stage in China is the Great Wall. Here you just have to skateboard to the end while collecting Krusty Heads. Actually, I did find this to be somewhat fun. By the way, Krusty Heads are kind of like coins. You earn 1-ups depending on how many you collect. After you beat all the main stages in an area, you'll fight a boss. Another improvement with Bart vs. the World is that now you can take up to 5 hits before you die. Also, the bosses feel more like actual bosses rather than some odd encounter at the end of a stage. I know music is subjective, but I do think the music is better in Bart vs. the World. To start, there are more than just 2 songs in the whole game, so that's good. We still hear the Simpsons theme, but it'll have a different flair depending on which stage you're in. When you're in the pyramid, the song has an Egyptian flair, for example. overall, the levels in Bart vs. the World are more streamlined and easier to get into. This game offers more content in the form of minigames, and the music has also been improved. Sadly, this game failed to address the Space Mutants' biggest problem, and that is the platforming and controls. In fact, I would say that those issues are even more prevalent in this game. The reason I say that is because there's just so much more platforming this time around, and the controls are just as shitty. The first stage in the North Pole is this ice cave, which is green for some reason. I mean, really? They couldn't have made it blue? Like, come on. There's a ton of jumping around. This particular section here gave me such a hard time. Just look at the pathetic attempt I made. The funny thing is that I'm actually pretty good at the Space Mutants, but this part of the cave just kicked my ass so hard. Like I said, the controls are the same, so A is jump, B is to use item, which in this game is your projectile attack. You have to press both A and B to jump with any semblance of speed, and to run, hold A after you jump. If you're good enough to make it out of this ice cave, you'll be treated to a stage where you have to ride icy platforms across several bodies of water. I fell so many times. This level here is similar to that section of the museum in Bart vs. the Space Mutants, but the icy lake in this game I think is easier to deal with, so thank goodness for that. Here's something that I don't quite understand. If you're a developer making a game and your controls are just not that good, why don't you change them? And if for some reason you can't, then why don't you construct stages that would better support your jank-ass controls? Like, if your controls are loose and unresponsive, then the levels should be built to make up for those loose and unresponsive controls. Unfortunately, that is not the case in this game. Let's take Super Mario Bros. 3 for example. Imagine playing through that game with the controls of Bart vs. the World. It would be one of the worst games ever. But Mario 3 has perfect controls, and the stages were built around those controls. That's a big part of why that game is so amazing. Now, I understand that Mario 3 is an incredibly high bar to reach, but that should always be the goal. Great controls and great levels that utilize and complement those controls. Even if your controls are not top-notch, the levels should still support those controls. You want to minimize the discrepancy between the controls and the level design as much as possible. Now, with all of that being said, I'll admit that the levels here are not that bad in terms of design. It's just that the bad controls make them seem worse than they are. Like, why do these platforms have to be so small? If they just made them a little bigger, that would have gone a long way in reducing the frustration. But there are so many places where the platforming is extremely rigid. Just look at this. Come on, really? They expect you to platform across little tiny blocks. But controls are kind of a funny thing because eventually you will get used to them, and once you do, they'll no longer piss you off. And then you might notice that this game is actually not too bad. The Space Mutants is the same way. If you hated the Space Mutants, avoid this game, but if you liked the Space Mutants, then you may enjoy Bart vs. the World. Well, that's all I have for today. Have you played this game? What's your opinion of it? Please leave any thoughts or opinions down below, as they always generate an interesting dialogue. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next video.